I'm going to be talking to Dr. Allan Tupper, who's a political scientist at the University of British Columbia, about the new federal cabinet named by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today. There were a couple of, I don't know if there were surprises, but very interesting appointments around climate and energy portfolios. So we'll talk to him about that. Welcome to the interview, Allan.
Thank you very much for having me. My pleasure.
Now, the big one that's got the tongues wagging out in Western Canada is the move by Stephen Guilbeault to environment and climate change. And it's a little controversial because he is a longtime climate activist, was with Greenpeace and then Equiterre at one point. And needless to say, some folks in Alberta and Saskatchewan are not too happy.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised by that reaction. I would mention, though, we'll see what Monsieur Guilbeault does as minister. And, you know, this is the Liberal Party of Canada. I don't think people, I think anyone even remotely aware of the party's history over the years sees it as the heartbed of Canadian radicalism on any questions. And so I don't think Trudeau, given the great weight his government and he has personally placed on the issue of climate change, is going to put in place someone deliberately to antagonize either the province of Alberta in particular or the oil and gas industry, which is, I think, under a lot of change anyway. So I would suggest that what someone did prior to politics and so on, you'll be very heavily moderated by the need to be a member of the Liberal Party, which again, I restate my position on that one. The other point that I think I would, well, 2 points actually, I'd highlight on this whole question. I think the former Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Wilkinson, going to natural resources is a nice counterpart there, and that they will have to work. That's a very key relationship that's got to be built. And I think that the federal government, particularly the Trudeau one, is quite keen to link natural resources to a whole set of questions, but one of them is its relationships with Indigenous peoples. And I think that's a very big issue. And we saw that all over the debates and the arguments with British Columbia and Alberta about the pipelines and all those kinds of episodes we've dealt with. And there has to be some kind of, I think, substantial rethinking of the relationships between the Indigenous peoples and the federal and provincial governments in terms of approving major energy projects that impact on their land base. That has to get picked up. So I think there's relationships there that have to be built by both Guilbeault and Wilkinson. I'd also add, though, and I think this is, you know, to my mind, an important point. It also has a BC link, but I don't think that's necessary, essential to the matter, but I think it's helpful. And that's the appointment of Joyce Murray as Minister of Fisheries, which has a lot of environmental consequences, a lot of links to First Nations people, both on the Atlantic and the Pacific coast, and will be a potentially important player in the debates about what's going to come out of the province of BC, LNG, you know, what's coming, what is it going to ship out of Vancouver, and all those kinds of questions. Is crude going to come through, and et cetera, many of which remain very unresolved. So I think there's that dimension too. And so there will be a strong Wilkinson, Murray, Guilbeault orientation in these questions, and other ministers. So going back to your first question, I think Mr. Guilbeault is going to be put to the fire quickly. He's actually a senior minister, the way I read the Trudeau priorities, and we've all been watching them. You said a number of things in your warm-up to this interview that are quite clearly I think, pertinent and quite correct. So this is going to be an important area, and the government's going to have to show some strength.
Well, yes, and I guess one of the things that we should point out is that there probably won't be any surprises coming out of environment and climate change, because the Liberal climate plan is really on the table. It's been coming since 2015. They amended it incrementally over that time. The Prime Minister, the party, and Mr. Trudeau made many commitments during the campaign. It really is pretty much fleshed out, and it really now is getting down to implementation of what the government's plan is anyway.
Yeah, and I think, though, those are very difficult steps. The implementation of a plan as ambitious as this. You've got the Kenney provincial government in Alberta, who would really like to tussle with the federal government, particularly one named Trudeau, to go back to a previous part of my life when I lived in Alberta for a long period, and it was a very active thing going on. And that, I think, is important. And other provinces, Saskatchewan has been very difficult on these questions too. So there's a lot of things that happen there. The industry itself is hard to tell. I mean, there's even in Alberta, there's some very green talking oil and gas companies. And so, nobody knows exactly those dynamics these days. And the other thing that's going on is the industry is in a much stronger position than it thought it would be. I mean, that's what's driving the TSX these days, is oil and gas, and many people had given it all up for renewables. So you have all those kinds of questions. And I think the other thing I'd add into the cabinet equation, I think consequential in some sense, is Randy Boissonnault's appointment to the cabinet, the only Alberta Liberal, the area of greatest Liberal electoral weakness for many years, and Associate Minister of Finance. I don't know quite what that role will obtain, but I think with Freeland as minister, it might be consequential. I just have no idea. Nobody does yet. But I think that's an important addition too. So, and then I just add one further point, which I've already alluded to. The implementation by the climate change plan. There's a lot of work to be done with First Nations on those too. And so all that stuff is going to, I think, keep Mr. Guilbeault's nose to the grindstone.
Indeed, I was going to add that Randy Boissonnault's primary role in cabinet may be Jason Kenney Wrangler. Maybe that's the title we can give him, because that clearly, I remember after the 2019 election, I wrote a column in which I said that, it's clear now the Liberals are committed to serious climate policy. All roads to decarbonization go through Alberta.
That's right.
There's no question about that. Quite right. Yeah, right. And I think we've had a couple of years where of incremental change, but now with COP26 coming up and so on, I think that we're in 2030 bearing down on us. I think we'll see the federal government be much moving more strongly towards implementation of these in a big way. And I think you're quite right. They will. So where do you think they will go, let's say Wilkinson and Guilbeault, in the next, say, a year or two? What might we expect from those ministers?
Hard to tell. And I think the major thing that I'm looking forward to seeing out of Wilkinson is where he is on renewable versus non-renewables, and that has been talked a bit about, but not a great deal. The other thing that I see from his point of view is the whole question of how he will deal with the provincial governments, but also in particular, how he will read public opinion in Alberta, which I think Mr. Kenney may not be as conversant with that as we think, that's a wrong way to put it. He is not possibly reading the cards quite as well as he might in that province. The province is not the way it was when, for example, I moved from Ontario to there at University of Alberta quite a few years ago now, 1976. It's a very different province. People, it's finally becoming, I think, more normal, not quite as unique. And I think it's taken a long, long while. But you look at Menchie and the Edmonton mayor and all those kinds of things that have gone on, hard to tell what's happening there politically. And so that's going to require some skill and some really careful thought, which I don't think, I'm sure Mr. Trudeau thinks about those issues sometimes, but I think this is going to be heavily upon the shoulders of the natural resource minister. And I think it's a challenge to figure out Alberta these days, and he'll have to put his best mind to it.
Well, final question, Paul. The Premier Kenney is currently sitting at 22% in the polls, and NDP leader Rachel Notley, former premier, is sitting at 50%. I don't think anybody expected in 2019 that would be the case, but here we are. Premier Kenney is deeply, deeply unpopular over his COVID-19 pandemic management. So does that make it does that make him weak and therefore easier to manage if you're the federal government? Or does that mean that he'll be scrapping for a fight with the federal government as a way to rebuild his political fortunes in Alberta?
Well, if he were where I'd go with what you just said, but I think the instincts will lead to a fight. I think that's the instinct still in large numbers of the activists within that party. And I think many people will see that as the way to go for him, who advise him. Whether public opinion leads him that way or should be, I have no idea, but I think that's where he'll head.
Well, it means, I guess, for we energy and climate journalists, that will make for an interesting few years as this unfolds. So, Paul, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.